Hello, and welcome to the Crime Folio. In our collection of cases, we often confront the darkest aspects of the human condition. Thank you for joining us today. The family unit is meant to be the ultimate sanctuary, a haven of love and trust. But what happens when that trust is irrevocably broken from within? We now turn our focus to one of the most disturbing phenomena in criminal psychology, the family annihilator. These are acts where an individual extinguishes the lives of their own loved ones. We will explore the motives, the patterns, and the devastating aftermath, seeking understanding in the face of the unthinkable. Case 1. The digital facade of Chris Watts. In the digital ecosystem of the 21st century, a family is not just a unit of people. It is a brand, a narrative, a curated stream of moments designed for public consumption. Few understood this better than Ann Watts. Her Facebook profile was a vibrant, living testament to the American dream, a sprawling tapestry woven with threads of love, success, and domestic bliss. Here, in this sun-drenched digital realm, she was the effervescent matriarch, a successful entrepreneur for the multi-level marketing company Lovell, and the adoring mother of two cherubic daughters, 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste. Her husband, Chris, was the quiet, handsome pillar of support, the doting father whose gentle smile was a constant, reassuring presence in photos and videos. Together, they presented a portrait of such idyllic perfection that it seemed almost immune to the quiet corrosions of everyday life. The family lived in a spacious, 5-bedroom house in Frederick, Colorado, a home purchased on the promise of a future as bright as the images Shannon broadcast to her thousands of followers. Every post was a celebration. Cece, with her fierce, joyful spirit, clutching a favorite blanket. Bella, the more thoughtful and sensitive older sister, her dark eyes full of nascent wisdom. There were videos of Chris wrestling playfully with the girls on the living room floor, of family vacations to sun-kissed beaches, of birthday parties with colorful balloons bobbing against the ceiling. In the summer of 2018, the narrative reached a new crescendo of joy. Ann was pregnant, 15 weeks along with a son they had already named Nico. The announcement was, of course, a social media event, a video of Chris reacting with apparent surprise and delight as Ann, wearing a shirt that read, "Oops. We did it again," revealed the news. He kissed her, his face a mask of loving contentment. For the outside world, the Watts family was not just thriving. They were ascending. But a facade, by its very nature, conceals. Behind the glowing screens and the carefully chosen filters, a different reality was taking root. The grand house in Frederick was a monument to a level of financial success they had not truly achieved. They had filed for bankruptcy in 2015, and the pressures of their mortgage and lifestyle were a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety beneath the surface of their perfect life. For 6 weeks that summer, while Ann and the girls were in North Carolina visiting her family, the hum grew into a roar for Chris. The distance, intended to be a temporary reprieve, became a chasm. Alone in the vast, empty house, Chris Watts began to construct a new life, one unencumbered by debt, fatherhood, or the relentless documentation of his existence. He met Nicole Kessinger, a coworker at Anadarko Petroleum. Their connection was immediate and intense. With her, he was not just Ann's husband or Bella and Cece's dad. He was a man with his own desires, his own future. He told Kessinger he was in the process of separating from his wife, painting a picture of a marriage long dead, a narrative of mutual discontent. He presented himself as a victim, a man trapped, yearning for freedom. In the digital world, he was the perfect family man. In the real world, he was meticulously planning its demolition. The two realities could not coexist. One had to be erased. The final family portrait was taken just before Shanann's return. She had flown to Arizona for a weekend Lavelle conference, a trip meant to re-energize her business and, perhaps, herself. The girls had stayed behind with Chris. On the evening of Sunday, August 12th, 2018, Shanann's friend and colleague, Nicole Atkinson, dropped her off at her home on Saratoga Trail. The time was approximately 1:48 a.m. on Monday, August 13th. The porch light was on. As the car pulled away, Atkinson saw Shanann walk through the front door, stepping out of the cool night air and into the silent, waiting house. It was the last time anyone other than her killer would see her alive. Inside, the air was thick with unspoken tension. According to Chris's later, shifting accounts, he and Shanann had what he termed an emotional conversation. She suspected his infidelity, the distance between them having become too vast to ignore. She had seen the signs, the subtle shifts in his behavior, the cooling of his affection. In text messages to friends from her trip, she had expressed a gnawing fear that her perfect world was beginning to fracture. "He has changed," she wrote. "I don't know who he is." That night, she confronted the stranger she now lived with. The conversation, however it truly transpired, was the final catalyst. For Chris, the life he had built with Nicole Cassandra, a life of freedom, a fresh start, was now in jeopardy. The facade had to come down, not with a gentle dismantling, but with a sudden, violent implosion. In the pre-dawn stillness of that suburban home, as his daughters slept soundly in their beds down the hall, Chris once attacked his pregnant wife. There was no argument that escalated, no sudden snap of rage. It was, by all accounts, a decision. He strangled her, the act a brutal and intimate finality. The life force he had vowed to protect, the mother of his children, the woman whose face smiled out from 100 photographs on the walls around them, was extinguished by his hands. The child she carried, Nico, died with her. The first part of his old life was erased. But the task was not complete. His new life required a clean slate, and a grieving, motherless father would be forever tied to his past. His daughters, Bella and Celeste, were witnesses not to the act itself, but to its immediate aftermath. In his most detailed confession, offered long after his conviction, Chris described how after he killed Shanann, Bella walked into their room. "What's wrong with Mommy?" she asked, seeing her mother's still form wrapped in a sheet on the floor. The ensuing events descend into a realm of horror that defies comprehension. Chris Watts, the man who had been filmed just weeks before, gently reading to his daughters, now treated them as inconvenient appendages to a crime. He wrapped Shanann's body in a bedsheet and dragged her downstairs and out to his work truck. He then put his two young daughters, still alive, still breathing, into the back seat. Bella and Celeste, likely terrified and confused, sat for the nearly 45-minute drive to a remote oil field owned by his employer, a desolate, windswept location known as Survey 319. They were captives, their father their jailer, driving them toward their own graves. One can only speculate on the terror of those two little girls in the dark, riding alongside the body of their mother. At the oil site, under the cold, indifferent gaze of the dawning Colorado sky, Chris pulled Shanann's body from the truck and buried her in a shallow grave he dug in the hard-packed earth. Then he turned his attention to his children. He took Celeste first. He smothered her with her favorite blue blanket as her sister, Bella, watched. He then dropped her small body through the 8-inch hatch of one of the massive oil tanks, her form plunging into the toxic sludge below. His final act of annihilation was against his firstborn. Bella, according to Chris, pleaded for her life. In her last moments, she reportedly cried out, "Daddy, no." It was a final, desperate appeal to the man she had loved and trusted, a man who no longer existed. He ignored her plea, smothered her as he had her sister, and pushed her body into the second oil tank. The father, the protector, had become the monster. He had erased his family. The final family portrait was now complete, a shallow grave and 2 submerged oil tanks in a lonely, forgotten field. With the physical evidence of his family disposed of, Chris Watts returned to his now silent home and began to perform the second act of his new life, the role of the concerned, distraught husband and father. At 5:27 a.m., he texted a coworker, feigning normalcy, discussing their work for the day. He then texted Shanann's phone, which he had in his possession, a series of hollow messages. "Can you call me, please? You okay?" The facade was re-erected with chilling speed. The first crack in his performance came when Shanann's friend, Nicole Atkinson, grew worried. Shanann had a 10 a.m. doctor's appointment, an ultrasound to see her baby, Nico. It was an appointment she would never miss. When Shanann didn't answer her calls or texts, Atkinson went to the house. Seeing Shanann's car still in the garage and receiving no answer at the door, she called the police. The body camera footage from that initial welfare check is a masterclass in deception. Officer Scott Coonrod of the Frederick Police Department arrived, and soon after, so did Chris, summoned from work by Atkinson. He unlocked the door and entered the house with the officer, his demeanor steady and practiced, low-key concern. He walked through the silent rooms, pointing out that Shanann's phone was there, her purse, her wedding ring left on the nightstand. She said she was going to a friend's house with the kids, he offered, a lie he had constructed just hours before. But I don't know who. He was calm, helpful, and utterly believable to the untrained eye. He even allowed a neighbor to help him check his home's security footage, a move of supreme, arrogant confidence. The next day, the performance escalated. Chris stood before television news cameras, his hands held in a posture of pleading, his voice soft with feigned despair. "Shanann Bella Celeste," he said, looking directly into the lens. "If you're out there, just come back. If somebody has her, just please bring her back. I need to see everybody. I need to see everybody again. This house is not complete without you 2 girls and the baby on the way." He spoke of their little quirks, how Celeste would wake up yelling, how Bella was a little jammer. He was creating a new fiction, a new narrative for public consumption, while their bodies lay miles away, abandoned in an industrial wasteland. But investigators are trained to see the cracks in a performance. Detectives from the Frederick Police Department and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation saw them. They saw a man whose grief seemed scripted, whose body language was devoid of the frantic energy of a truly desperate parent. They saw a man who referred to his family in the past tense. The investigation quickly zeroed in on him. His digital life, once his greatest asset in building a facade, now became his undoing. Phone records revealed the intense, secret affair with Nicole Kessinger. She, in turn, cooperated fully with police, realizing the man she thought she knew was a liar and, quite possibly, a killer. She revealed that he had told her his divorce was almost final. The lie was the cornerstone upon which the entire investigation was built. The turning point came on Wednesday, August 15th, 2 days after the murders. Investigators asked Chris to take a polygraph test. It was a strategic move, a tool designed to apply psychological pressure. Chris agreed, confident he could outsmart the machine, just as he had outsmarted the news cameras and the concerned neighbors. He failed spectacularly. The needles danced, betraying the truth his calm exterior tried to conceal. Confronted with the results, the facade finally began to crumble. In a long, tense interrogation with CBI agent Graham Coder and FBI Special Agent Tammy Lee, Chris Watts clung to one last, desperate lie. He confessed that his family was dead, but he constructed a new narrative to mitigate his guilt. He claimed that after he told Shanann he wanted a separation, he saw her, via the baby monitor, strangling Celeste in her bed, with Bella already blue and lifeless in her own room. In this monstrous fiction, he had killed Shanann in a fit of righteous rage after witnessing her commit the ultimate maternal betrayal. It was a story designed to make him a victim, a man who had reacted, not acted. He even led investigators to the oil field, revealing the location of his family's bodies, as if to prove the veracity of this new, twisted tale. But the evidence did not support his story. The autopsies would later confirm that the girls had been smothered. There was no evidence of Shanann harming them. It was a lie born of pure, self-serving cowardice. Under the weight of the facts and the relentless questioning, this final narrative collapsed as well. On August 21st, 2018, Chris Watts was formally charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder, unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and tampering with a deceased human body. Faced with the prospect of a trial and the death penalty, Chris Watts accepted a plea deal. On November 6, 2018, he pleaded guilty to all charges. The deal spared him execution but condemned him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During his sentencing on November 19th, Shanann's family delivered heart-wrenching victim impact statements. Her father, Frank Erzosek, looked at the man who had been his son-in-law and said, "You are a monster. You heartlessly took the lives of two beautiful children who adored you." Chris Watts sat in silence, a hollowed-out version of the man whose smiling face still lingered on Shanann's Facebook page, a digital ghost in a dead woman's curated heaven. He was sentenced to 5 life sentences, 3 consecutive and 2 concurrent plus an additional 84 years. He was transferred to a secure prison out of state, his existence reduced to the 4 walls of a cell, a stark contrast to the sprawling house on Saratoga Trail. The case of Chris Watts is a uniquely modern tragedy. It is a story about the chasm between the curated self and the authentic self, about how the pressures of maintaining a perfect image can fester into a darkness capable of annihilating everything one claims to hold dear. The digital facade he and Shanann built was beautiful, but it was brittle. Behind it was a man so pathologically selfish, so devoid of empathy, that he could look into the eyes of his own children and see only obstacles to his personal happiness. He chose a fresh start, and the price was the lives of 4 people, including his own unborn son. The final family portrait is not one of a smiling family on a beach, but of a desolate oil field, a place of industry and extraction that became a makeshift tomb, a permanent, silent testament to a facade that concealed an unfathomable void. Case 2. The Patriarch's Phantom, John List. Long before the curated perfection of social media, the facade was a more tangible construct. It was built of brick and mortar, of manicured lawns and hushed whispers behind starched curtains. In the affluent town of Westfield, New Jersey, one of the most imposing of these facades was a 19-room Victorian mansion at 431 Hillside Avenue. Known as Breeze Knoll, it was a grand, decaying testament to a bygone era of prosperity, complete with a ballroom and a magnificent Tiffany stained glass skylight rumored to be worth a small fortune. To the outside world, this was the home of John Emil List, a man who embodied the very ideal of the post-war American patriarch. John List was a man of impeccable order. A World War II and Korean War veteran, he was now a seemingly successful accountant, a devout Lutheran who taught Sunday school, and the head of a family that appeared, from a distance, to be the picture of quiet respectability. His daily routine was a testament to his obsession with control. He was precise, meticulous, and deeply religious. In his mind, life was a ledger sheet, a series of debits and credits that must, at all costs, be balanced. He was the unquestioned authority in his home, a quiet, severe presence whose approval was sought and whose judgment was feared. Living under his rigid rule were his family members, each a satellite orbiting his gravitational pull. His wife, 46-year-old Helen, was once vibrant but had grown increasingly withdrawn, plagued by poor health and a reliance on alcohol that she hid from the teetotaling John. She also harbored a devastating secret from her diagnosis of syphilis contracted from her first husband, a fact she had concealed from John for decades. The shame and the long-term effects of the illness had taken their toll, leaving her a ghost within her own home. There was also List's elderly mother, 84-year-old Alma, who lived in an apartment on the third floor, a constant, frail presence. And then there were the children, poised on the precipice of a world that terrified their father. Patricia, at 16, was a bright and ambitious high school junior with a passion for acting. She was beginning to test the boundaries of her father's strict control, dreaming of a life beyond Westfield, a life that was her own. John Jr., 15, was a sophomore who, like many boys his age, struggled with the weight of paternal expectation, his quiet nature often clashing with his father's rigid ideals. The youngest, 13-year-old Frederick, was a freshman, an energetic boy loved by his classmates. They were children of the late 1960s and early 1970s, a generation defined by social upheaval, a world of changing morals and questioning authority that John List viewed as a rising tide of sin threatening to engulf his family. The grand mansion, Breeze Knoll, was itself a lie. List had purchased it to project an image of wealth and stability that was rapidly crumbling. In reality, he was drowning in debt. He had recently been fired from his job as a vice president at a Jersey City bank, a humiliation he could not bear to admit to his family. Each morning, he would put on his suit, kiss his family goodbye, and leave for work, spending his days at the train station, reading newspapers and managing the slow-motion collapse of his finances. He was systematically siphoning money from his mother's savings accounts to keep the creditors at bay, but it was not enough. The ledger would not balance. Foreclosure loomed. The facade was about to shatter. For John List, financial failure was inextricably linked with moral failure. In his severe, black-and-white worldview, poverty was not just a hardship, it was a stain, a pathway to sin and damnation. To allow his family to suffer the indignity of welfare, to watch them be exposed to the temptations of a fallen world without the protective armor of prosperity, was unthinkable. A different solution began to form in his mind, a plan that was, in its own horrifying way, an act of supreme control. It was a final, terrible accounting. If he could not save his family in this life, he would save their souls for the next. He would send them to heaven, unsullied by the shame that awaited them. He believed it was the only compassionate, the only logical thing to do. In the weeks leading up to November 1971, John List began his meticulous preparations. He was not planning an escape, he was planning a departure. He contacted the children's schools and the family's various activities, explaining that they would be going on an extended trip to North Carolina to visit Helen's ailing mother. He canceled the milk delivery, the mail, and the newspaper subscriptions. He was systematically erasing his family's presence from the world, clearing the board before making his final move. He chose the weapons with the same dispassionate logic, his own father's 9mm Steyr semi-automatic handgun and his own .22 caliber revolver. The day he chose was Tuesday, November 9th, 1971. It began like any other. The children ate breakfast and left for school. John Jr. and Freddie walked out the door, while Patty was driven by her father. Once the house was quiet, the final accounting began. He walked up the stairs to the master bedroom where his wife, Helen, was finishing her morning coffee. He shot her once in the back of the head. He then went up to the third-floor apartment. His mother, Alma, was making her breakfast. He approached her, kissed her on the cheek, and shot her above the left eye. He later claimed she had no idea what was happening. With his wife and mother dead, John List began the most surreal part of his plan. He dragged Helen's body from the kitchen into the ballroom, placing her on a sleeping bag. He would later claim he couldn't bear to see her in the kitchen. He cleaned up the blood from both scenes with a chilling fastidiousness. Then, he sat down at the kitchen table and ate lunch. Afterwards, he drove to the bank to close his own and his mother's bank accounts, withdrawing the last of their funds. He stopped at the post office to halt the family's mail. It was a day of errands, punctuated by acts of execution. He returned to the empty, silent mansion and waited. Patricia was the first of the children to come home from school. As she walked through the door, he shot her in the back of the head. A short time later, Freddie arrived. He met the same fate, shot once in the head. He carried their bodies into the grand ballroom and laid them out on sleeping bags, side by side, near their mother. He left their school bags by the door. The patriarch had gathered his flock. Only one remained. John Jr. had a soccer game after school and was late coming home. The waiting stretched the afternoon into the early evening. When the 15-year-old finally arrived, something in the house, perhaps the unnatural silence or his father's demeanor, alerted him that something was terribly wrong. He confronted his father, and for the first and only time that day, List's plan faltered. John Jr. fought back. He ran. List pursued him through the cavernous house, firing his gun repeatedly. The boy was shot 10 times, a frantic, chaotic end that stood in stark contrast to the clinical precision of the other murders. Finally, John Jr. collapsed and died in the ballroom, joining the rest of his family. The ledger was now complete. But List's work was not finished. He took his son's body and arranged it on a sleeping bag alongside the others. Then, he sat down at his desk in his study and wrote a 5-page letter to his pastor, Reverend Eugene Rowinkle. In neat, controlled prose, he explained his actions. It was not a confession of a man consumed by guilt, but the rationalization of a man convinced of his own righteousness. He explained his financial ruin and his fear that his family would fall away from their faith. "At least I'm certain that all have gone to heaven now," he wrote. "If things had gone on, they would have fallen away from the church. It may seem cowardly, but I feel that I have the easy way out by giving my life for this. I'm only concerned with making my peace with God." He stated that he had also prayed over each body, asking for forgiveness and entrusting their souls to God. His final acts were as methodical as his first. He cut his own picture out of every family photograph in the house, an attempt to erase himself from the record, to make himself a phantom. He turned the thermostat down to preserve the bodies, tuned the radio to a classical music station, filling the vast, silent house with the solemn sounds of an organ, and left it playing. Then, on the evening of November 9th, 1971, John List walked out of Breeze Knoll for the last time, leaving the lights on throughout the house to give the illusion of occupancy. He drove to JFK Airport, parked his car, and vanished. For nearly a month, the phantom lights of Breeze Knoll burned into the Westfield night. Neighbors noted the silence, but the stories List had planted about the trip to North Carolina held their curiosity at bay. It was Patricia's drama coach who finally grew suspicious. He knew how dedicated she was, and her prolonged, unexplained absence was out of character. After repeated, unanswered calls, he and another teacher went to the house on December 7, 1971. They peered through a window into the dimly lit ballroom and saw what appeared to be bodies laid out on the floor. The police were called immediately. What they found inside was a scene of unparalleled, refrigerated horror. The 5 bodies, perfectly preserved in the cold, lay in neat rows. The funereal organ music still echoed softly through the mansion. On the desk in the study, they found the letter to the pastor, a detailed and chilling blueprint of the killer's mind. The manhunt for John List was one of the largest in the state's history, but it was fruitless. He had a 24-hour head start and had planned his disappearance with the same cold logic he had planned the murders. The trail went cold almost immediately. John List, the pious patriarch, had become a ghost, a legend of suburban horror. Breeze Knoll, the scene of the crime, stood as a grim, silent monument until it was destroyed by a mysterious fire in August 1972, erasing the last physical traces of the List family. Years turned into a decade and then more. The case became a chilling piece of American folklore, the story of the boogeyman who could be your quiet, church-going neighbor. But in 1989, a fledgling television show called America's Most Wanted decided to feature the 18-year-old cold case. They enlisted the help of a forensic artist named Frank Bender. Bender was more than a sculptor. He was a psychological profiler who worked in clay. He studied old photos of List, read the psychological profiles, and came to a profound conclusion. A man as rigid and controlled as John List, he reasoned, would not fundamentally change. He would resist the aging process. Bender created a bust of what he believed List would look like, older, with thinning hair and heavy, thick-rimmed glasses, but with the same tight jaw and severe expression. He had captured the soul of the man, not just his face. On May 21, 1989, the segment aired. The bust, looking uncannily like a real person, was revealed to millions of viewers. Hundreds of tips flooded in, but one, from a woman in Denver, Colorado, was different. She recognized the man.
He wasn't John List, she said.
He was her former neighbor, a quiet, unassuming accountant named Robert Bob Clark. He had since moved to Virginia with his second wife, a woman named Dolores Miller, whom he had met at a church gathering. FBI agents tracked Bob Clark to his modest home in a Richmond suburb. They staked him out, noting his resemblance to the bust. On June 1, 1989, they arrested him. At first, he steadfastly maintained his identity as Robert Clark. But the evidence was undeniable. His fingerprints were a perfect match to John List's military records. After 17 years, 10 months, and 22 days, the Phantom had been caught. His trial in 1990 was a national spectacle. The defense argued that List suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder from his military service, which, combined with his obsessive-compulsive personality, led him to commit the murders in a disassociated state. List himself took the stand, speaking in a calm, detached voice as he recounted the murders. He showed no remorse, only a steadfast conviction that his actions were a form of mercy. "I felt that I was chasing them to heaven," he said. He was asked if he ever considered another option, like seeking help from his church. He replied that he felt it was a personal problem and that his pride would not allow him to accept charity. The jury rejected his defense. They saw not a man who had snapped, but a man who had planned. He was found guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms in prison. John List, the man who had appointed himself the arbiter of his family's salvation, would spend the rest of his life in a New Jersey state prison. He died of complications from pneumonia in 2008 at the age of 82, still believing, to the very end, that he had done the right thing. The case of John List is a chilling exploration of pride, piety, and the dark logic of a disturbed mind. It serves as a stark reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not those who lurk in the shadows, but those who live in the light, cloaking an abyss of narcissism and control behind a facade of absolute normality. He did not kill his family because he hated them. He killed them because he could not bear for the world to see the man by extension. He was anything less than perfect in his own rigid, twisted definition of the word. The final portrait he painted was not for them, but for himself. A man so righteous he would rather murder his family than let them live with the shame of his failure. Case 3. The Mornington Monster, John Sharp. The Mornington Peninsula, southeast of Melbourne, Australia, is a place where the land and sea conspire to create an illusion of perpetual holiday. It is a landscape of gentle coastlines, renowned wineries, and affluent seaside towns where life seems to move at a more civilized, sun-drenched pace. In the autumn of 2004, the town of Mornington itself was the very picture of this relaxed, domestic ideal. It was here, in a modest but comfortable rented house on Prince Street, that John Bones Sharp lived with his de facto wife, Anna Marie Kemp, and their 20-month-old daughter, Gracie. To neighbors and acquaintances, they were an unremarkable family, another young couple navigating the early years of parenthood. John, 37, was a big, solidly built man who worked as a shearer and had a reputation for being quiet and easygoing. Anna, 41, was a vibrant and loving mother, originally from New Zealand, who was 4 months pregnant with their second child. She was overjoyed, eagerly anticipating the new arrival and the expansion of their small family. Their daughter, Gracie, was a bright, happy toddler with her mother's dark hair and a smile that could charm anyone. She was the center of their world, a giggling, toddling embodiment of their shared life. From the outside, the house on Prince Street was a container for a simple, budding domesticity, as ordinary and pleasant as the town in which it stood. But inside, the foundation of this life was being eaten away by a quiet, corrosive resentment. The second pregnancy, a source of such joy for Anna, was for John a point of intense and growing pressure. Their finances were already strained, and John saw another child not as a blessing, but as a burden, another mouth to feed, another anchor holding him to a life he was beginning to feel was not his own. He had wanted Anna to have an abortion, a suggestion she had flatly and tearfully rejected. For her, the child was already real, already loved. For him, it was a mistake, a complication that threatened the future he secretly envisioned for himself, a future free of the constraints of fatherhood and partnership. The quiet house on Prince Street was not a home, it was a pressure cooker, and John Sharp was beginning to listen to the hiss of the escaping steam. His internal narrative began to shift. He started to see Anna and even Gracie not as his family, but as obstacles. He fantasized about a different life, one where he could come and go as he pleased, spend his money on himself, and be beholden to no one. This was not a sudden, violent snap, but a slow, cold calculus. The man who appeared to be a placid, agreeable partner was methodically detaching himself, emotionally and psychologically, from the people who loved him most. He was beginning to view them as problems for which a final, efficient solution was required. The weapon he would choose was not one of rage, but of cold, silent intent, a high-powered spear gun he had purchased months earlier, ostensibly for fishing. On the afternoon of Tuesday, March 23, 2004, the pressure inside John Sharp reached its critical point. He and Anna had another argument about the pregnancy and their finances. The details of the fight are known only to him, but its conclusion was absolute. As Anna lay watching television on a mattress on the floor of their living room, John went to the shed. He retrieved the spear gun, a long, menacing instrument of underwater hunting. He returned to the house, walked up behind her, aimed the weapon at her right temple, and fired. The steel-tipped spear penetrated her skull, killing her instantly. There was no scream, no struggle, just a sudden, shocking silence. The life of Anna Kemp and her unborn child were extinguished in a single, brutal moment. John Sharp looked at what he had done, and his first emotion was not panic or remorse, but a chilling, pragmatic sense of purpose. He had solved the first half of his problem. He pulled the spear from his wife's head and left her body where it lay. He then went into another room to continue watching television, the flickering screen a pale, indifferent light in the now silent house. But the problem was not fully solved. Gracie was still there. For the next 2 days, John Sharp lived in the house with the body of his dead wife and his living daughter. It is a period of time that defies easy psychological explanation. He fed Gracie, played with her, and put her to bed, all while her mother's body lay concealed in the next room. Perhaps it was a moment of hesitation, a flicker of a conscience not yet entirely dead. Or perhaps, more chillingly, it was simply a matter of logistics. He was waiting for the right time, biding his time until he could complete the task. On Thursday, March 25th, he decided the time had come. Gracie, he reasoned, was a witness. She was a link to Anna, a permanent reminder of the life he was determined to erase. She was the final obstacle. He took the same spear gun he had used on her mother. He held his 20-month-old daughter in his arms, aimed the weapon at her head, and fired.
Twice.
After the first shot failed to kill her instantly, he reloaded the powerful weapon and fired again, ensuring her death. He had now completed his work. The house was finally, completely silent. The life he had built was annihilated. Now the performance began. With the same dispassionate efficiency he had applied to the murders, he set about disposing of the evidence. He wrapped Anna's body in a tarpaulin and Gracie's small form in plastic bags and a sheet. He bundled them together and placed them in the back of his Ford Falcon station wagon. He drove them to a local nursery and hid them in a pile of pine bark. Then he returned to the house and began to meticulously clean. He scrubbed the bloodstains from the mattress and the floor, packed up Anna's and Gracie's belongings, clothes, toys, photographs, and took them to the local dump. He was not just cleaning a crime scene, he was systematically expunging their very existence. A few days later, he returned for the bodies, drove them to the Mornington Rubbish and Recycling Depot, and buried them in a landfill, covering them with dirt and grass clippings. He had literally thrown his family away. With the physical evidence gone, he began to construct his fiction. He sent a text message from Anna's phone to her family, creating the illusion that she had left him. He told friends and family a story of a sudden departure, that Anna, depressed and overwhelmed, had taken Gracie and walked out on him. He played the part of the confused, wounded partner, a man bewildered by his wife's sudden abandonment. His performance reached its apex on national television. Anna's family in New Zealand, particularly her mother and her sister, were not convinced by his story. It was completely out of character for the devoted Anna they knew. Their persistent, frantic calls and their contact with the police led to a public appeal. On April 20th, 2004, nearly a month after he had murdered them, John Sharp sat beside his father and Anna's mother, Val, for a televised press conference. He looked directly into the cameras, his face a mask of placid concern, and pleaded for his wife's return. "Anna, I love you," he said, his voice steady. "I want you to come home. Gracie, my little princess, I miss you, and I love you very much." He described Gracie's favorite toys and the sound of her laughter. It was a masterful, chilling performance of feigned grief. He appeared so convincing that for a moment, even Anna's mother, sitting beside the man who had murdered her daughter and granddaughter, felt a pang of sympathy for him. He was a man playing a role, and he was playing it with terrifying conviction. But behind the scenes, The investigators of the Victoria Police Homicide Squad were not convinced. They saw a man whose grief lacked depth, whose story was full of inconsistencies. His calm demeanor was not that of a frantic father, but of a man with something to hide. They focused their attention on him, digging into his life, his finances, his relationships. The net began to tighten. They bugged his house and his car, listening in as he continued to weave his web of lies to friends and family. The pressure continued to build. Investigators re-interviewed him, pointing out the holes in his story. They presented him with evidence that contradicted his claims. They questioned him about the spear gun. For weeks, he held firm, the quiet, agreeable facade refusing to crack. But the weight of the deception and the relentless, methodical work of the detectives was becoming too much to bear. The final collapse came on June 22, 2004, 3 months after the murders. During another interrogation, something inside John Sharp finally broke. Perhaps it was the psychological exhaustion of maintaining the lie, or perhaps it was the cold, inescapable reality of the evidence mounted against him. He confessed. In a quiet, matter-of-fact tone, he told the detectives everything. He described the arguments, the use of the spear gun, the murder of Anna, and then, 2 days later, the murder of Gracie. He then agreed to lead them to the bodies. He directed the police to the Mornington Refuse Center, a vast landscape of other people's discarded lives. He pointed to a specific spot. Under the gaze of horrified detectives and forensic crews, excavators began to carefully peel back the layers of earth and rubbish. They soon found them. The bodies of Anna Kemp and her daughter Gracie, wrapped in their makeshift shrouds, were recovered from their undignified grave. The search was over. The performance had ended. John Sharp pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder. In his sentencing, the judge, Justice Bernard Bongiorno, described his crimes as in the higher range of heinousness. He rejected any notion that Sharp had been suffering from a significant depressive illness, instead painting a picture of a profoundly narcissistic and selfish man. You determined that your daughter, an obstacle to your freedom, had to be killed, the judge stated. You proceeded to do that in a calculated and cold-blooded way. He was sentenced to life in prison with a non-parole period of 33 years. John Sharp, the man who wanted freedom from his family, would spend the majority of his life in a world defined by its absence. The quiet, easygoing man from Mornington was revealed to be a monster of terrifying proportions, not a monster of passion or rage, but one of cold, calculated convenience. The case of John Sharp is a stark portrait of the banality of evil. It demonstrates how a seemingly ordinary man, driven by a profound and pathological selfishness, can decide that the people he is supposed to love and protect are nothing more than inconveniences to be disposed of. His final family portrait was not a photograph to be framed, but a scene of horror to be excavated from a landfill. He did not seek to save his family from some perceived moral decay, as John List did. He sought only to save himself from a life he no longer wanted. He erased them from the world with the same emotional detachment one might show when taking out the trash, a final, chilling testament to a heart that had become an absolute void. Case 4. The Unholy Acts of Chris Coleman. In the vast, complicated tapestry of American life, there are certain archetypes that resonate with a particular power. One of the most potent is that of the Christian family man, strong, devout, a protector of his home, and a pillar of his community. He is a man whose life is built upon a foundation of faith and moral certainty. In the small, quiet town of Columbia, Illinois, a peaceful suburb nestled just across the Mississippi River from St. Louis, no one seemed to embody this archetype more completely than Christopher Coleman. Columbia was the kind of town where people moved to feel safe, a place of well-kept homes, good schools, and a palpable sense of community. And at the heart of this idyllic picture, on the quiet cul-de-sac of Robert Drive, was the Coleman family. Chris, 32, was a former Marine, handsome and physically imposing, a man who projected an aura of quiet capability. His wife, Sherry, 31, was vivacious and kind, a devoted mother whose life revolved around her two sons, 11-year-old Garrett and 9-year-old Gavin. The boys were energetic and beloved, deeply involved in sports and school, the kind of children who fill a home with noise and life. To the outside world, the Colemans were more than just a family. They were an ideal. This ideal was powerfully reinforced by Chris's profession. He was the personal bodyguard and head of security for Joyce Meyer, one of the world's most prominent televangelists. Joyce Meyer Ministries, or JAM, was a global empire built on the tenets of prosperity gospel and positive confession. Millions followed Meyer's teachings through her books, broadcasts, and stadium-sized conferences. To work in her inner circle was to be seen as not just an employee, but a guardian of the faith. Chris Coleman traveled the world with Meyer, ensuring her safety, a silent, watchful presence standing at the side of a global spiritual leader. The job came with a 6-figure salary, a high degree of trust, and an implicit stamp of moral rectitude. He was, in a very public way, a defender of a Christian worldview. The family's life reflected this status. Their 2-story home was comfortable and spacious. Their days were a familiar rhythm of school, soccer practice, and family time. Sherry was the quintessential hands-on mom, ferrying the boys to their activities, volunteering, and creating a warm, nurturing home. Chris, when he wasn't traveling for work, was the doting father, coaching their sports teams, a visible and respected figure in the community. They were the living embodiment of the values his employer preached: blessed, prosperous, and secure. But in the autumn of 2008, a shadow fell over this perfect picture. It arrived not as a sudden storm, but as a series of insidious digital whispers. In November, a threatening email arrived, addressed to Chris. The message was vague but menacing, hinting at violence and referencing his connection to Joyce Meyer. Over the ensuing months, the threats escalated. More emails arrived, along with letters sent to the family's home. The language grew more profane and specific. "Tell that Joyce to stop preaching, or your family is in danger," one read. Another warned, "I'm watching you. Your family is not safe." Chris, the professional security expert, seemed to be doing everything right. He reported the threats to the Columbia police. He installed a home security system. He was a man under siege, fighting to protect his family from a faceless enemy, an anti-religious extremist angered by the global reach of Joyce Meyer Ministries. The community rallied around them. The police investigated, but the sender was clever, using anonymous accounts and public Wi-Fi to mask their location. The threats became a dark undercurrent in the family's life. In January 2009, someone tampered with their mailbox. The letters became more terrifying. The final one, received in late April, was the most chilling of all. "This is your final warning. I will kill them all as they sleep." The family on Robert Drive was living under a death sentence, issued by a phantom. This narrative, the pious family terrorized by a religious fanatic, was the public facade. Behind it, Chris Coleman was living a second, secret life, one that stood in stark opposition to everything he publicly represented. The architect of this secret life was Tara Lintz, a cocktail waitress from Florida whom Sherry had known since high school. Chris and Tara had begun a torrid affair in the fall of 2008, at the very same time the threats began to appear. Their relationship was a world away from the suburban domesticity of Columbia. It was a life of secret rendezvous, passionate encounters in hotel rooms, and exotic travel. Using his position with JMM, Chris flew Tara to his security details in Hawaii, Arizona, and Las Vegas. He showered her with gifts and promises of a future together. He told her he no longer loved his wife, that their marriage was over in all but name, and that he was filing for divorce. To Tara, Chris was not a family man. He was her future husband, a man on the verge of starting a new life with her. The pressure from this second life was mounting. Tara was growing impatient. She wanted the divorce to be finalized. She wanted to be with Chris openly. The idyllic life in Colombia was not a sanctuary for Chris. It was a prison. He was trapped between the woman he desired and the family that formed the bedrock of his public identity and lucrative career. A divorce would be messy and public. It would shatter his image as a faithful Christian husband. It could very well cost him his job with Joyce Meyer Ministries, an organization that preached the sanctity of marriage. He would lose his income, his status, and the respect of his community. Chris Coleman found himself at a crossroads. He needed to eliminate his family, but he also needed to preserve his image. A simple divorce was not the answer. But the threats offered a different path. He had spent months carefully constructing a narrative of persecution. He had created a boogeyman, a phantom enemy on whom he could pin the blame. In his twisted, narcissistic logic, murder was the cleaner solution. It would make him a tragic hero, a grieving widower and father, a victim of the very evil he fought to protect his employer from. It would free him to be with Tara, preserve his job, and garner him the sympathy of the world. He was not just planning a murder. He was scripting a tragedy in which he would play the lead role. In the pre-dawn hours of May 5, 2009, the final act of his script was set in motion. At approximately 5:43 a.m., Chris Coleman left his home on Robert Drive, dressed in his workout clothes, and drove to a local gym. It was part of his routine, the perfect cornerstone for an alibi. He worked out, establishing his presence on the gym's security cameras. An hour later, he began calling Sherry's phone, knowing she would not answer. After several unanswered calls, he enacted the next part of his plan. He called a neighbor, a Columbia police officer, and in a voice thick with manufactured panic, asked him to check on his house. He said he was worried. His wife wasn't picking up the phone. The officer, a friend of the family, walked over to the Coleman house. He found the front door slightly ajar. He called out, but there was only silence. He drew his weapon and entered the home. What he found inside was a scene of calculated horror. Spray-painted in red on the walls of the hallway and living room were obscene messages. "I am always watching," one read. "Punished," said another. It was the work of the phantom, the killer from the letters. Upstairs, the full scope of the atrocity was revealed. In their respective beds, as if merely asleep, lay the bodies of Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin. All three had been strangled. There were few signs of a struggle. It was a scene of chilling, brutal finality. The protector's family had been slaughtered in their beds, just as the final letter had threatened. When Chris arrived at the scene, he collapsed on the lawn, his body racked with theatrical sobs. He was the picture of a man whose world had just been utterly destroyed. The community, the police, and the media all descended on Robert Drive. The story was immediate and explosive. The family of a prominent televangelist's bodyguard murdered by a religious extremist. The FBI was called in. A massive manhunt began for the phantom killer. But for the seasoned investigators of the Major Case Squad of Greater St. Louis, something about the scene felt wrong. There were no signs of forced entry. The strangulations were efficient, almost intimate, lacking the chaotic violence one might expect from a frenzied fanatic. And the graffiti, meant to be the killer's calling card, seemed too convenient, too perfectly aligned with the pre-existing narrative of the threats. They looked at the grieving husband, and beneath the performance of despair, they saw a man. And that man became their primary suspect. The investigation began to dismantle Chris Coleman's carefully constructed world, piece by digital piece. His alibi was thin. The timeline showed it was possible, though tight, for him to have committed the murders before leaving for the gym. The red spray paint from the crime scene was a specific brand and color, and detectives found that a local store had recently sold cans of that exact paint. But the true undoing of Chris Coleman was his digital life. Forensic investigators excavated his computers and phone records, and the secret world he had hidden so carefully came flooding into the light. They found the affair with Tara Lentz. They uncovered thousands of texts, emails, and explicit photographs. They found a sexually explicit video of Chris and Tara, filmed on his phone during one of their secret trips, in which he promised to be with her by May 5, the very day of the murders. The date was no coincidence. It was a deadline he had set for himself. Tara Lentz, realizing the horrifying truth, cooperated fully with the police. She told them everything: his promises of divorce, his complaints about his wife, his desire for a new life. She had been a pawn in his deadly game. The motive was now crystal clear. He didn't want a divorce. He wanted an erasure. The final piece of the puzzle was the threats themselves. Digital forensic experts traced the anonymous emails back to their source, a computer owned by Chris Coleman. He had written them himself. The phantom who had terrorized his family was him. The boogeyman was a self-portrait. On May 18, 2009, less than 2 weeks after he had played the role of the grieving victim on his front lawn, Chris Coleman was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The man who had built his identity on the foundations of faith and protection was revealed to be a monster of profound hypocrisy. His trial in 2011 was a grim spectacle. The prosecution laid out the mountain of evidence: the digital trail of the affair, the forensic link to the emails, the damning video with the May 5th deadline. The defense could offer little more than the theory that the police had been blinded by tunnel vision, ignoring the real killer. But they had no evidence, no suspect, no answer to the prosecution's unassailable case. The jury saw through the facade. They saw a man so consumed by his own selfish desires that he was willing to methodically execute his wife and 2 young sons to achieve them. They saw a man who used his religion not as a source of comfort or guidance, but as a costume to conceal the rot within. On May 5, 2011, exactly 2 years to the day after the murders, Chris Coleman was found guilty on all 3 counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He showed no emotion as the verdict was read, his face a cold, blank mask. The case of Chris Coleman is a chilling study in the duality of man, a testament to the darkness that can flourish behind a facade of piety. He did not kill for God or against God. He used the idea of God as a prop in his own profane theater. The final family portrait he created was not one of a loving family in a peaceful suburban home, but of a crime scene desecrated with fake messages of hate, a stage set for a lie. He sacrificed his wife, Sherry, and his sons, Garrett and Gavin, on the altar of his own convenience, believing he could get away with it by hiding behind the cross. But the truth, as it so often does, found its way into the light, exposing an act so unholy it defies all faith. The portraits we have examined are not of monsters who lurk in the shadows of our imagination, but of men who walked among us fathers, husbands, and neighbors. They are a chilling reminder that the most pristine facades can hide the most profound darkness, and that the title of family man can sometimes be the most terrifying mask of all. The final portraits they created, painted in blood and betrayal, serve as solemn memorials for the innocent lives they chose to erase. We remember the victims, not as statistics in a true crime narrative, but as individuals whose light was extinguished far too soon. May they rest in peace. Good night.